In a secluded corner of La Mancha, where time slumbered under the weight of dust, lived a nobleman whose life was filled only with the shadows of the distant past. Alonso Quixano, a man whose face was chiseled by the years, had surrendered his soul to the seduction of books, those massive volumes that chronicled the tales of wandering knights. He did not merely read, he devoured the stories until the threads of reality slipped through his fingers, replacing them with a fragile fabric of illusions and alleged heroics. He spent long, arduous nights chasing the phantoms of knights at dusk, until his brain dried up from lack of sleep and excessive reading, and his cramped room transformed into a grand battlefield. In every line, he saw the cry of the oppressed calling out, and in every paragraph, a dragon threatening a kingdom. Thus he decided that the world could no longer wait, and that he must awaken chivalry from its slumber. Thus, armed with the hammer of madness and the anvil of will, he embarked on transforming himself from a simple country gentleman into the great knight Don Quixote de la Mancha. He dusted off his ancestors' rusty, centuries-old armor and searched for a helmet. Finding only an incomplete headpiece, he fashioned the rest out of cardboard. Here, madness was not merely the absence of reason, it was a rebellion against the monotony of existence, a desperate attempt to paint a crimson color in a world engulfed in ash and oblivion. He felt that the blood coursing through his veins had turned into ancient ink, yearning to chronicle epics humanity had never known before, epics inhabited by honor and justice. That was the beginning, the start of the journey toward the impossible, where there is no difference between truth and mirage, and where reason is the only obstacle standing in the way of the soul's glory. But a knight is incomplete without a steed to carry his dreams. Alonso searched his stable for the creature that would share his glory, finding only a gaunt horse with protruding ribs, nearly collapsing under the weight of its own breath. He spent 4 days contemplating a name worthy of this magnificent steed, finally settling on Rocinante, a name that bridged its past as a common nag and its present as the foremost of chivalric mounts. After the horse, it was necessary for the knight to find a lady for his heart, for a knight without love is like a tree without leaves, or a body without a soul wandering in a void. He recalled a simple peasant girl from a nearby village named Aldonza Lorenzo, but his wild imagination transformed her into the noble princess Dulcinea del Toboso. Aldonza knew nothing of this legendary infatuation, and Don Quixote had no need for her to know, for in his world, love was an act of pure will. He saw in her the perfection of beauty and the epitome of purity, vowing that every victory he achieved would be an offering on the altar of his chaste love. Thus, with a weary horse and a love woven from moonbeams, the knight's preparations were complete, and he stood ready to set foot upon the land of merciless adventure. Don Quixote's tragedy lies in his desire to dress the present in the garments of the past, and to force the world to be nobler than it truly is. He believed that chivalry was not merely a sword and shield, but a moral covenant connecting the creature to the creator, making sacrifice the ultimate purpose of existence. He set forth in the magic of dawn, as the stars bid the sky farewell, heedless of the mockery of fate that awaited him around the very first bend in the road. Under the scorching sun of La Mancha, which melts iron and blinds the senses, Don Quixote set out on his first sally, alone save for his burning thoughts. Anxiety began to creep into his heart, not for fear of enemies, but because he had not yet been formally knighted, an unforgivable flaw for a noble warrior, according to the laws of chivalric lore. As evening overtook him, he saw from afar a simple, dilapidated inn frequented by shepherds and wayfarers. However, his eyes, accustomed to visions, beheld it as a fortified castle with silver ramparts. He approached the door with great solemnity, waiting for a dwarf to emerge from atop the tower to announce with a trumpet the arrival of the valiant knight. But he found nothing but the barking of dogs and the silence of the wind. The innkeeper, a cunning man well versed in human nature, came out and was astonished by the sight of this strange figure who spoke an archaic tongue and demanded the hospitality of kings. The innkeeper quickly realized that his guest had lost his wits, so he decided to indulge him in his madness, seeking either amusement to break the boredom of the night or perhaps out of pity for his plight. He was served a meal of salted fish and stale bread, which Don Quixote consumed as though it were a sumptuous banquet, convinced that the inn was an enchanted castle and the serving girls were royal ladies in waiting. Mockery lurked in every corner, but the knight was immune to the truth. His inner certainty was too strong to be shattered by the sordidness of reality. He spent the night keeping vigil over his armor by the inn's well, performing the rites of chivalry under the starlight, ready to confront any intruder who dared approach. In that moment, he embodied the height of human tragedy, a man fighting for dead values in a world that no longer believes in anything it cannot touch or sell. With the first light of dawn, Don Quixote urged the innkeeper to complete the ceremony of his knighthood, so that he might carry out his duties without any legal or legitimate obstacle. The innkeeper, the governor, agreed and brought out a ledger of hay and barley accounts, pretending it was a book of prayers and sacred rites, in a scene where farce mingled with holiness. He ordered the knight to kneel, then struck him twice lightly on the shoulder with Don Quixote's own sword, mumbling meaningless words, while the servant girls struggled to stifle their laughter. Don Quixote did not realize that this ceremony was a bitter mockery. Rather, he considered it the moment he was born anew, the moment he became part of the history of the greats. He left the inn feeling a lightness in his soul, as if the heavy armor had become wings carrying him over the hills of La Mancha, searching for the first oppressed soul to champion. On his way, he encountered a farmer beating a young boy, so he rushed toward him shouting in medieval tongue, ordering him to stop immediately and respect the code of chivalry. The farmer, frightened by the sight of this armored madman, promised to release the boy and pay his wages. However, as soon as the knight was out of sight, he redoubled the boy's beating and torment. Don Quixote's first heroic act was a curse upon the one he intended to protect, a bitter truth that would repeat itself often throughout his journey, that good intentions are not enough to fix the world. But the knight rode away, proud of his illusory victory, drifting through the realm of his delusions, unaware that injustice is not defeated by resonant speeches, but by a power that understands the complexities of reality. He rode on, ecstasy filling his very being, singing to the princess Dulcinea, while the harsh truth followed his trail like a shadow that never leaves.
Don Quixote returned home broken after his first failed battle, only to find his two friends, the priest and the barber, waiting for him with an anxiety tinged by the desire to save what remained of his sanity. The two friends decided that the ailment lay in those cursed books, so they embarked on a strange literary trial, tossing the volumes from the window into a blazing fire in the courtyard. They examined the books one by one. This one was consigned to the flames for its absurdity, while that one was spared for the beauty of its language, in a scene reflecting society's struggle with unbridled imagination. They burned Amadis of Gaul and Palmerin of England, believing that by burning the paper, they were burning the illusions that had taken root in their poor friend's mind. When Don Quixote woke up and searched for his library, they told him that an evil enchanter had flown away with it and hidden it, seeking to instill in him a hatred for a new imaginary enemy. This only fueled his determination for revenge, as magic, in his eyes, was the only explanation for every failure he encountered in a world that had lost its luster. The priest and the barber represented the voice of reason and logic, yet in their attempt to cure him, they employed the very tools of his madness, creating for him enemies he had never even dreamed of. Fighting imagination with logic is a losing battle from the start, for imagination dwells in the secret chambers of the soul, where neither the fire of the hearths nor the counsel of the wise can reach. Don Quixote remained in bed, dreaming of his second sally and planning even greater adventures, while the ashes in the courtyard grew cold, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of an even greater tragedy. He perceived that the outside world was conspiring against him, the very fuel of both genius and madness, the feeling that you alone possess the truth in a forest of falsehood. Don Quixote did not remain long at home, for he realized that a knight needs a loyal squire. Thus, he saw in his peasant neighbor, Sancho Panza, the ideal partner for his journey. Sancho was a simple man, carrying the burdens of bread and soil upon his shoulders. But Don Quixote's promises to make him the governor of a remote island awakened a naive greed within him, and so the two opposites came together, the dreaming knight chasing the stars, and the realistic follower who saw the stars only as guides on the path to earning his bread. They set off under the cover of night without bidding anyone farewell, followed by Sancho's donkey, Dapple, who carried on his back his owner's hopes for quick riches. Their dialogue was the very essence of the novel, an endless debate between philosophy and the stomach, between the call of duty and the call of instinct, on a journey in search of the meaning of existence. Sancho repeatedly tried to bring his master back down to earth, but the magic of Don Quixote's words always lifted them to the heights of imagination, where stones became castles. Each found in the other what he lacked. The knight found an audience for his delusions, and the peasant found a purpose for his monotonous life, even if that purpose was a mirage. They traversed the paths of La Mancha, writing with their footsteps the strangest story of friendship in history, a friendship that fed on illusion and endured through hardships. The ground beneath them was hard and dry, but their hearts beat to the rhythm of epics yet to be written, awaiting their first encounter with the unknown. Sancho did not know that he would not become the governor of an island, but would instead witness the breaking of the noblest soul time has ever known, in a world that has no respect for dreamers. In the heart of the plain of Montiel, 30 or 40 windmills suddenly emerged, standing majestically with their long arms swaying in the wind, like guardians of eternity. Don Quixote cried out in a voice full of zeal, "Look, Sancho, there rise hideous giants, and I shall engage them in a battle to rid the earth of their wicked race." Sancho tried desperately to explain to his master that they were merely windmills, and that what he perceived as arms were nothing but wooden sails. However, the voice of logic was drowned out by the clamor of the knight's imagination. Don Quixote rebuked him, accusing him of cowardice and ignorance in the ways of adventure. He then dug his spurs into Rocinante's flanks and charged toward the nearest windmill, crying out the name of Dulcinea. He thrust his lance into the rotating sail of the windmill, but the wind caught it with such immense force that it shattered the lance into splinters and hurled both the knight and his horse to the ground in a resounding fall. Sancho rushed to aid his master, who lay in the dust, pained by his condition, and asked him with bitter irony, "Did I not tell you they were windmills?" But the answer was always ready. Dusting the dirt off his dented armor, the knight replied, "Be silent, Sancho, for the tides of war are ever changing. Surely the sorcerer Freston has transformed those giants into windmills to rob me of the glory of victory." Such is the final defense of the dreaming soul. When reality fails it, it invents hidden forces to explain its failure, ensuring that faith in its ideals remains pure and untarnished. The battle was not against wood and stone, but against a fate that refuses to bow to the individual's will, and against a time that has turned heroism into a target of ridicule. They continued on their way, the knight leaning on the remnants of his lance, and his squire shaking his head in sorrow, while the windmills kept turning, indifferent to these ants trying to ram mountains.
The windmills were but an appetizer for greater misfortunes. Soon, Don Quixote encountered a procession including 2 monks and a lady from Biscay, whom he imagined was a princess kidnapped by demons. A fierce fight broke out with the lady's escort, a man of strong resolve unaccustomed to the whims of knights, and they exchanged blows that nearly cost one of them their life at that lonely bend. At that point, the narrative suddenly halts, as the author claims the manuscript has reached its end, only to find the remainder in a market in Toledo, written in Arabic. This literary device, invented by Cervantes, turns reality into a mirage with multiple narrators, and renders Don Quixote a hero who transcends languages and cultures. The battle raged on. Don Quixote's helmet fell, and his blood flowed. Yet he ultimately succeeded in subduing his adversary, on the condition that he go and apologize to the lady Dulcinea. Sancho watched the scene in terror, questioning the fate of his promised island, while his master took pride in his wounds, viewing them as medals of honor upon the chest of time. The wound on Don Quixote's body healed swiftly, thanks to the illusory balsam of Fierbras, but the wound to his pride bled with the persistence to continue the path. The force driving this man is not physical strength, but the power of an idea that never dies, even if its champion is defeated in every material clash. Every drop of blood shed upon the soil of La Mancha was like ink writing a new history.
a history that does not acknowledge defeat as long as the conscience remains clear. The two companions continued their journey, under a sky beginning to portend storms, unaware that what had passed was merely a stroll compared to what awaited them in the Sierra Morena mountains.
Fleeing from justice after a failed adventure to free prisoners, Don Quixote and Sancho took refuge in the gorges of the Sierra Morena mountains, amid silent rocks and deadly solitude. There, the knight decided to perform the ritual of penance for love, imitating the heroes of romances who isolate themselves in the wilderness to woo their cruel mistresses. He began to lament his fate and perform acrobatic feats that were simultaneously comical and tragic, believing that the echo of this torment would reach the heart of Dulcinea in El Toboso. He wrote a highly eloquent love letter on a tattered piece of paper and ordered Sancho to carry it to his princess, describing her with attributes that exist only in the imagination of poets. Sancho knew that Dulcinea was nothing but a coarse peasant woman who smelled of garlic, but fearing his master's wrath, he set off on his alleged journey. In that isolation, Don Quixote's madness manifested as an act of worship, where one does not need a witness to be faithful to one's principles, even if those principles are pure illusion. The mountains echoed his cries, as if nature itself pitied this old man, who wasted the autumn of his life chasing a spring that would never come. The true tragedy is not that we do not reach what we want, but that what we want may not exist in the first place, yet we insist on searching for it. He remained alone among the rocks, communing with the stars, considering pain to be the necessary price for transcendence, and solitude to be the knight's true kingdom. When Sancho returned with the priest and the barber, who had come to retrieve him by trickery, Don Quixote had lost much weight, but he had not lost a shred of his imagination.
In one of his adventures on the road, Don Quixote saw a barber wearing a brass basin on his head to shield himself from the rain, and he immediately believed it to be the legendary helmet of Mambrino. He attacked him with all his might, seized the basin, and placed it over his cardboard helmet, convinced that he was now invincible against swords and arrows. They returned to the inn that had been the scene of previous events, and there, in the middle of the knight awoke in a delirium, imagining he was fighting giants who were stealing a treasure. There were wineskins hanging there, which he mistook for giants and began stabbing with his sword. The skins burst, and red wine flowed everywhere, leading him to believe it was the blood of his defeated enemies. The innkeeper was enraged by the loss of his wine and tried to strike the knight, but the latter was basking in the ecstasy of victory, oblivious to the havoc he had wrought. This overlap between brass and gold, and between wine and blood, is a mirror of Don Quixote's soul, where the trivial is transformed into the precious by a touch of his imagination. That night at the inn was the height of the chaos that madness creates when it collides with the simple interests and livelihoods of ordinary people. Sancho tried to contain the scandal, while his master delivered a speech on the superiority of arms over letters and the honor of fighting for forgotten principles. The world mocks the knight, but in truth, it is the knight who mocks the triviality of a world that sees nothing but wine behind the wineskins. The battle ended with financial reparations, and Don Quixote remained convinced that he had saved the kingdom from a looming evil, sleeping in his humble bed like a crowned king.
To return him home against his will, the priest and the barber resorted to a clever trick, convincing him that he had fallen under the influence of a great enchantment that required him to be placed in a wooden cage. Don Quixote did not resist. Instead, he surrendered to his fate with a strange dignity, considering enchantment to be the tax that great knights pay to their envious enemies among the wicked sorcerers. The mournful procession moved through the paths of La Mancha, the knight in his cage and Sancho following him in tears, in a scene representing the imprisonment of the dreaming soul within the narrow molds of society. People emerged from their houses to gaze at the madman, while he greeted them with his handkerchief as if he were in a grand victory parade, transforming humiliation into glory through the power of illusion. This cage was not merely wood and bars. It was a symbol of a world trying to frame genius and stifle rebellion under the guise of treatment and wisdom. From behind the bars, Don Quixote spoke to Sancho, trying to convince him that greatness is not measured by physical freedom, but by the freedom of imagination, which cannot be imprisoned. The journey was long and humiliating, yet the knight maintained his pride, analyzing the types of magic that had brought him to this state as if he were studying a sacred science. He finally arrived home, where his niece and housekeeper received him with tears, believing the journey had ended and that his mind had returned to its senses. But they did not realize that the Don Quixote who returned was no longer the old Alonso Quixano. He had become a walking legend, merely waiting for another chance to escape. His body was weary, but his soul had tasted the sky, and he who has touched the clouds can never again be content living in the burrows of the earth. In the second part of the novel, Don Quixote sets out once again, but this time he finds that the world has changed. People have come to know his story through the book published about his adventures. People no longer mocked him spontaneously. Instead, they began setting up organized traps and pranks for their amusement, turning his tragedy into a grand theatrical performance. On the shores of Barcelona, a mysterious knight appeared to him, calling himself the Knight of the White Moon, and challenged him to a fateful duel in defense of the beauty of his lady. This knight was, in reality, the young Sansón Carrasco, who had disguised himself to defeat Don Quixote and force him to return home and retire for a year. The two knights collided, and Don Quixote fell beneath the hooves of his opponent's horse, marking the only true defeat for which his imagination could find no escape. In a faint and broken voice, the knight lying in the dust said, "Dulcinea is the most beautiful woman in the world, and I am the most wretched knight. Finish me with your sword." The victorious knight refused to kill him, settling for imposing the condition of his return. Thus Don Quixote returned home, carrying the heaviest kind of defeat, the defeat of the dream before a reality disguised in the garb of another dream. The silence of the sea at that moment was harsher than the cries of war, and the breaking of the spirit was deeper than the breaking of the armor, for he realized that the age of miracles had passed forever. He walked the way back with his head bowed, not as a knight returning from battle, but as a walking funeral, mourning in his heart humanity's last hopes for nobility. His defeat was the victory of triviality over transcendence, and the victory of cold logic over the fire of burning passion, the moment when death began to seep into his pores. When he reached his deathbed, the sad miracle occurred. The fog lifted from Alonso Quixano's mind, and he fully regained his senses, seeing clearly the futility of his past illusions. He said sorrowfully, "I am no longer Don Quixote. I am Alonso Quixano, who was once called the Good. I was mad, and now I am sane, but this clarity has come too late." Sancho Panza wept by his side, imploring him to return to his madness, saying, "Do not die, my master. Let us go out into the fields to become shepherds and find Dulcinea beneath an enchanted tree." Sancho's tears were the greatest testament to Don Quixote's success, for the truly mad is he who could plant the seeds of imagination in the heart of a simple man, who once saw nothing but the dirt of the ground. He wrote his final will, apologizing for all the trouble he had caused, and requested that the books of chivalry, the cause of his life's ruin, be burned. But it was too late to save the flesh. He peacefully gave up his spirit, leaving behind a world made poorer by his departure, a world that lost the madman who reminded it of the beauty of the impossible and the honor of the attempt. Alonso Quixano the Good died, but Don Quixote de la Mancha never truly died. He lives on in everyone who dares to battle windmills, and in everyone who sees enchanted beauty amidst ugliness. Cervantes' novel is a cry in the face of existence, telling us that noble madness is 1,000 times better than base sanity, and that life without dreams is merely a long wait for the grave. Here lies the knight who knew no fear, who found in death a deliverance from a world that could no longer contain his vast heart, leaving us a flicker of light in the twilight of time. Farewell, Don Quixote, master of dreamers, who taught us that true heroism is to remain faithful to oneself, even if the whole world deems you mad.